The date is May 1st, 1960. It is the most sacred day on the Soviet calendar, May Day. Red Square in Moscow is prepared for a massive display of proletarian might, a carefully choreographed theater of tanks and ballistic missiles designed to project invincibility to the West. But 4,000 miles away, on the desolate southern fringe of the Soviet Union, the illusion of invincibility is flickering on a green phosphor screen. It is 5:36 in the morning, Moscow time. At a radar station near the border of Afghanistan and Tajikistan, a Soviet operator stares at his scope in disbelief. The P-30 radar sweeps the sky, a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse that usually shows nothing but the empty, calm airspace of the Rodina. But today, there is a blip. It is faint, steady, and terrifyingly calm. The operator checks his instruments. He recalibrates the elevation sweep. The data coming back makes no physical sense. The target is entering Soviet airspace, cruising north from Peshawar. That is not the confusing part. The confusion lies in the altitude. The return signal indicates the object is cruising at 20,000 meters over 65,000 feet. In 1960, this number is an impossibility for an operational combat aircraft. The standard Soviet interceptors, the MiG-19 aircraft, begin to shudder and stall long before they reach that height. Their engines starve for oxygen in the thin air, and their aerodynamics fail. To the radar crew, the blip looks like a glitch, a phantom echo, or perhaps a high-altitude weather balloon drifting on the jet stream. But balloons do not hold a steady course. Balloons do not correct their heading. The station commander picks up the secure line. The message is relayed up the chain of command, bypassing the usual filters, moving with electric speed from the border outpost to the central command of the PVO Streny, the Soviet Air Defense Forces. The report lands on the desk of General Yevgeny Savitsky. The general is a hardened man, a hero of the Great Patriotic War, and he is not interested in glitches. He demands verification. Every radar station along the southern border is queried. The answer is unanimous and chilling. The object is real, it is solid, and it is flying higher than anything the Soviet Union possesses. This is the central mystery that paralyzes the command room. What kind of machine flies at the edge of space, moving too slow to be a ballistic missile, but too high to be a plane? It is a technological paradox. It violates the known laws of aerodynamic propulsion as understood by Soviet engineering at the time. Before we unravel the hunt for this impossible machine, if you want to explore the hidden history of the great power struggles that defined the 20th century, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We declassify the past, one mission at a time. Back in the command center, the confusion turns to aggressive desperation. General Savitsky knows that Premier Khrushchev is preparing for the May Day parade. The Premier is currently in a buoyant mood, believing the Soviet Union has achieved parity with the United States. If news reaches him that an American intruder is flying with impunity over the heart of the motherland on this specific day, heads will roll. The order is given: destroy the target. Use all available means. This order triggers a chaotic scramble across the southern military districts. At air bases near the border, pilots are jolted from their barracks. They run to their machines, the MiG-19 aircraft and the newer, experimental Sukhoi Su-9 interceptors. The mechanics on the ground are baffled. They look at the flight vectors and the altitude reports. They know the service ceilings of these jets. Sending a MiG-19 aircraft to catch a target at 65,000 feet is like trying to catch a high-flying bird by jumping from the ground. It is an exercise in futility. But in the Soviet military, you do not argue with the radar. You obey the order. One of the pilots, Captain Igor Mentyukov, is sitting in the cockpit of a Su-9 interceptor. His situation is the definition of a nightmare. He is on a ferry flight, moving the aircraft from the factory to a deployment zone. His plane is unarmed. He has no missiles. He has no cannon shells. His guns are sealed shut. Yet, his radio crackles with a command that makes his blood run cold. The voice of the controller is frantic. "Dragon, take off immediately. Target is high altitude. Destroy target." Mentyukov asks for clarification on the weapons load. The response is blunt and final. "Ram him." The Soviet command is so baffled, so terrified by the impunity of this intruder, that they are willing to turn their newest, most advanced jet into a manned missile. Mentyukov ignites his afterburner. The Su-9 roars down the runway, tearing into the morning sky. He is hunting a ghost. He pushes the throttle past the red line, the nose of his jet pointing almost vertically into the dark blue zenith. As Mentyukov climbs, He watches his altimeter spin. 10,000 meters. 12,000. 15,000. The air outside is thinning. His engine temperature is spiking. The controls are becoming slushy and unresponsive. He is fighting the physics of flight, trying to drag his heavy steel machine into the domain of the intruder. On the ground radar, the controllers watch the two blips. The fast, desperate blip of the Su-9 closing the distance, and the slow, arrogant blip of the intruder, cruising steadily, unbothered, untouchable. Mentyukov strains his eyes against the glare of the Sunday. At these altitudes, the sky is not blue. It is a deep, bruised purple, fading to black. And then, for a split second, he thinks he sees it. A glint of silver. A cross shape against the darkness. It looks unnatural, the wings are too long, like the limbs of a strange insect. It doesn't look like a weapon of war. It looks like a science fiction illustration brought to life. He pulls back on the stick, trying to angle his nose for the ramming impact. But the Su-9 has nothing left to give. The aircraft shudders violently. The aerodynamics of the delta wing fail in the thin air. The jet stalls, nose dropping heavily, tumbling back toward the earth. Mentyukov recovers the spin, furious and shaken. He radios back. Contact lost. Cannot maintain altitude. The intruder flies on. It has passed the first line of defense as if it wasn't even there. The KGB and the military command are now in a state of full-blown crisis. This is not just a border violation. It is a demonstration of absolute technological dominance. The Americans, if it is indeed the Americans, have built a machine that renders the entire Soviet air defense network obsolete. They are watching, they are photographing, and there is absolutely nothing the Soviet Union can do to stop it. Or so it seems, because as the intruder pushes deeper into the interior, heading toward the industrial heartland of the Urals, a new order is being typed out at a missile battery near Sverdlovsk. The pilots failed, the guns failed. Now, they will turn to a weapon that has never been tested in combat against a target like this. The mystery of the high-altitude ghost is about to meet the brute force of the rocket age. The intruder is now deep within the Soviet interior, drifting silently over the Chelyabinsk region. It has been hours since the first radar contact. To the men in the PVO Strany command bunkers, this persistence is agonizing. The blip on the screen is not behaving like an enemy aircraft. It is behaving like a satellite that has somehow dipped into the atmosphere. It moves with a terrifying robotic consistency. On the ground, the paranoia is reaching a fever pitch. In 1960, the Soviet Union is a fortress of secrets. The cities below the flight path, Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, are closed cities. They do not appear on civilian maps. They are the atomic forges of the empire, where plutonium is refined and warheads are assembled. The idea that an American camera is currently passing over them, clicking shutter frames every few seconds, recording the layout of the Soviet nuclear program, is a strategic catastrophe of the highest order. General Savitsky is on the line with the regional commanders. The failure of the interceptors, the inability of the MiG-19 aircraft and the Su-9 to reach the target has shifted the burden to the rocket forces. The Soviet Union has a new card to play, the S-75 Divina, known to NATO as the SA-2 guideline. These are not subtle weapons. They are telephone pole-sized missiles, 11 meters long, fueled by highly toxic kerosene and nitric acid. They are designed to swat heavy bombers out of the sky with a 195-kilogram fragmentation warhead. But using them against a single, slender target at the very limit of the missile's range is a gamble. The guidance radar, the fan song, struggles to lock on to the small radar cross-section of the intruder. At a missile battery near Sverdlovsk, Major Mikhail Voronov receives the order. The atmosphere in the command trailer is suffocating. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of vacuum tubes. Voronov looks at his scope. He sees the target. But he also sees something else clutter. The sky is not empty. In their desperation, the Air Defense Command has flooded the airspace with every available aircraft. MiG-19 fighters are still scrambling, trying to pop up from below to get a visual ID. This creates a chaotic environment for the missile crews. The IFF identification friend or foe systems are notoriously unreliable in the 1960s. The transponder codes often lag or fail to sync. Voronov is looking at a screen filled with ghosts. Which blip is the American spy? Which blip is a Soviet pilot trying to defend his country? The pressure from Moscow is absolute. Destroy target 8,630. There is no room for hesitation, yet hesitation is the only thing preventing fratricide. The mystery of the intruder deepens for the radar operators. As they track the object, they notice its speed is shockingly low, around 400 knots. This confuses the firing solution computers, which are calibrated for high-speed jet bombers. The Americans have sent a glider to fight a missile war. It is an asymmetrical tactic that the Soviet engineers hadn't fully anticipated. The low speed means the missile has to lead the target less, but the high altitude means the missile's control fins will be barely effective in the thin air. At 8:53 in the morning, Major Voronov makes the decision. He cannot wait any longer. The intruder is approaching the maximum engagement envelope. If he waits, the target will drift out of range and disappear toward the north, perhaps to escape via Norway. Fire! The button is pressed. Outside the trailer, the ground shakes. A blast of flame erupts as the booster ignites. The S-75 missile roars off the rail, accelerating to Mach 3 in seconds. A moment later, 2 more missiles follow. A salvo of 3 rockets tearing through the troposphere, hunting the Silver Cross. Inside the intruder's cockpit, the pilot likely sees nothing but the dark curvature of the Earth, but his instruments would be screaming. The radar warning receiver lights up. He is being painted by the Fansong radar. Back on the ground, the operators watch the merge. The missile blips and the target blip converge on the display. Then, the radar screen blooms. A cloud of static. Contact lost. "Target destroyed," an operator shouts. A cheer goes up in the command trailer. They have done it. The impossible machine has been swatted down. But the celebration is premature and horrifyingly short-lived. In the chaos of the intercept, another missile battery nearby, unaware that Voronov has already fired, picks up a target on their scope. They see a blip descending from the altitude of the explosion. They assume it is the American aircraft taking evasive action or dropping altitude to hide. They lock on. They fire. Tragically, they are not tracking the American. They are tracking a Soviet MiG-19 aircraft flown by Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov. He is one of the pilots sent to chase the ghost. He is responding to the IFF query, but the ground codes have not been updated for the new day. The missile slams into the MiG-19 aircraft. Safronov is killed instantly. The Soviet air defense network is in such a state of panic and confusion caused by this single American plane that they are shooting down their own men. The fog of war is absolute. Meanwhile, high above, the first explosion has indeed done its work. The proximity fuse of Voronov's first missile detonated behind the tail of the American plane. Shrapnel tore through the stabilizer. The delicate, glider-like wings, designed for lift, not structural trauma, snapped off. The machine is disintegrating. But for the KGB officers rushing to the predicted crash site near the village of Koselino, the mystery is far from solved. As reports come in from the local collective farms, the confusion only grows. Peasants are reporting debris falling from the sky, strange, lightweight metal that feels like foil. They report seeing a parachute. The KGB needs answers fast. Was this a robotic drone? Was it a nuclear bomber that failed to detonate? Or was it something else entirely? When the recovery teams arrive at the crash site, they find the wreckage scattered over a vast area, and then they find the pilot. He is alive. This changes everything. The Soviets expected a charred corpse or a robot. Instead, they have a man who is currently checking his pockets, trying to hide a poisoned needle. A man carrying a pistol with a silencer, a survival kit with gold coins, and a map of the Soviet Union that is more accurate than the ones available to the Soviet military. The capture of the pilot is not the end of the mystery, it is the beginning of a massive intelligence operation. The KGB does not broadcast this capture to the world, not yet. They realize they have an ace in the hole. Washington believes the pilot is dead. Washington believes the plane was destroyed completely, leaving no evidence. The Americans will likely release a cover story, a weather plane lost off course in Turkey. Premier Khrushchev decides to wait. He decides to let the Americans lie. He wants to see how deep the deception goes. He orders the wreckage to be gathered, every scrap of it, and brought to a hangar for reconstruction. He orders the pilot to be taken to the Lubyanka prison in Moscow for interrogation. The Soviets are no longer baffled by the altitude. Now they are obsessed with the purpose. As they sift through the wreckage, they find the cameras. The lenses are massive, unlike anything Soviet optics have produced. When they develop the film found in the debris, the clarity of the images shocks the analysts. They can see the lines on the parking lots of the factories. They can count the cars. The realization hits the Kremlin like a physical blow. The Americans haven't just been flying over. They have been reading the Soviet Union like an open book for years. The invincibility of the Iron Curtain was a myth. But the world doesn't know this yet. The trap is set. The Americans are about to walk into a diplomatic ambush that will humiliate the President of the United States. And it all begins with the silence of the Kremlin. Washington, D.C. is quiet, but inside the White House the atmosphere is radioactive. The CIA has lost contact with the U-2 aircraft. They know it is down. They know it was deep inside Soviet territory. But they are operating on a critical, fatal assumption. Francis Gary Powers is dead. The CIA's logic is grim but calculated. The U-2 is a fragile aluminum tube filled with volatile fuel. A missile strike at 70,000 feet results in explosive decompression. If the blast didn't kill the pilot, the fall would. And if by some miracle he survived the fall, he had the sailed dollar, a silver dollar containing a needle dipped in shellfish toxin. The pilots were not explicitly ordered to commit suicide, but the expectation was that no pilot would allow themselves to be captured alive by the KGB. Based on this assumption, President Eisenhower approves the cover story. It is a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. On May 3rd, NASA issues a press release. They claim a high-altitude weather research aircraft, a Lockheed U-2, has gone missing during a flight over Turkey. The pilot, they say, reported oxygen trouble and likely drifted unconscious over the Soviet border. It is an innocent mistake, a scientific tragedy. To sell the lie, they even paint a U-2 aircraft at a NASA base with fake serial numbers and parade it for the press. The United States paints itself as the transparent, scientific victim of Soviet aggression. In Moscow, Premier Nikita Khrushchev reads the American press release and smiles. He has been waiting for exactly this. He has the wreckage, he has the pilot, he has the confession, but he says nothing. He watches the Americans dig the hole deeper. On May 5th, Khrushchev addresses the Supreme Soviet. He announces that a spy plane has been shot down. But, and this is the masterstroke, he deliberately omits the fact that the pilot is alive. He sets the trap. The US State Department walks right into it. Thinking Khrushchev is bluffing or only has scattered debris, they double down on the lie. Spokesman Lincoln White stands before reporters and righteously defends the weather plane story. He suggests the Soviets are paranoid barbarians for shooting down a wayward scientific instrument. The American media rallies around the flag. The world looks at the Soviet Union with disdain. Then, on May 7th, Khrushchev returns to the podium. The hall is packed. The world's ambassadors are watching. Khrushchev looks out at the assembly and drops the hammer. "I must tell you a secret," he booms. "When I made my first report, I did not tell you that the pilot is alive and well. We did this deliberately, because I saw that the Americans were preparing a fable." The room erupts. Khrushchev produces the evidence. He doesn't just hold up a piece of metal, he displays the pilot's survival pack. He lists the contents: a silenced pistol, 7,500 rubles in gold coins, a poison pin, and the high-resolution photographs of Soviet military bases. "He is quite alive," Khrushchev mocks, "and he is singing like a nightingale." The shockwave hits Washington instantly. The cover story disintegrates. The President of the United States has been caught in a bald-faced lie on the international stage. It is a humiliation unprecedented in American diplomatic history. The weather plane excuse becomes a global punchline. But for the KGB and the Soviet military engineers, the political theater is secondary. The real shock is happening inside a hangar in Moscow, where the wreckage of the U-2 is being reassembled piece by piece. As they study the twisted metal, the anger turns to begrudging awe. They are realizing that they haven't just shot down a plane, they have shot down a piece of the future. The engineering of the U-2 is unlike anything in the Soviet inventory. It challenges their understanding of how an aircraft should be built. The Soviet engineers are looking at the wings and scratching their heads. The aspect ratio is enormous. The metal is terrifyingly thin. It looks less like a fighter jet and more like a bicycle made of foil. They realize the entire aircraft is a flying fuel tank. But the biggest mystery, the thing that truly keeps the Soviet scientists awake at night, is not the airframe. It is the equipment inside. As they pry open the sensor bays, they find technology that shouldn't exist. Radar jammers that operate on frequencies the Soviets hadn't even thought to monitor. Cameras with lenses so precise, they defy the limits of optical manufacturing known to the East. The Soviets realized they have been fighting a war in the dark. The U-2 wasn't just taking pictures, it was listening. It was recording radar signatures. It was mapping the electronic nervous system of the USSR. Khrushchev puts the wreckage on public display in Gorky Park. It is meant to be a trophy of victory. Ordinary Soviet citizens line up to see the spy machine. They look at the battered fuselage with pride. We shot it down, they think. But the military experts walking through the exhibit see something different. They see a terrifying gap in technology. They see a machine that flew over their heads for 4 years, untouchable. And they know that if the Americans have this, what else do they have? What is flying higher than the U-2? The shoot-down of Gary Powers was a tactical victory, but it revealed a strategic nightmare. The KGB demands answers. They want to know exactly how this machine works. They want to clone it. But as they try to reverse engineer the U-2, they run into a wall. The metallurgy, the fuel chemistry, the camera optics, it is alien technology to them. And while the world focuses on the trial of Gary Powers, a deeper question emerges in the halls of the Pentagon. The U-2 is dead. The secret is out. But the need for intelligence hasn't gone away. If the Soviets can shoot down a plane at 70,000 feet, the US needs something that flies higher or faster. The end of the U-2's impunity does not bring peace. It triggers the greatest acceleration of aerospace engineering in human history. The mystery of how the U-2 worked is solved, but it births a new, far more dangerous mystery. The Americans are already building the successor, and this time it won't be a glider. It will be a titanium monster designed to outrun the very missiles that took down Powers. But before we get to the future, we must look at the specific technology that baffled the KGB during the autopsy of the U-2. What exactly did they find inside that fuselage that made Soviet scientists question their own reality? The public spectacle in Gorky Park was theater. It was a propaganda carnival designed to show the Soviet people that the imperialist eagle had been brought down by the righteous hammer of socialism. But the real story, the story that would haunt the Kremlin for the next decade, was unfolding in a restricted hangar at the State Scientific Research Institute for Aviation Systems, known as GOS-NISE. Here, the wreckage of the U-2 aircraft had been laid out on the concrete floor like the bones of a prehistoric creature. It was a jigsaw puzzle of twisted aluminum, shattered glass, and torn wiring. The room was silent, save for the scratching of pencils and the shuffling of boots. The best minds of the Soviet aerospace industry had been summoned. Aerodynamicists from the Sukhoi and Mikoyan design bureaus, chemists from the fuel institutes, and optical physicists from the defense sector. They were there to answer the question that had paralyzed the PVO Strainy: how? How did a subsonic aircraft with a single engine fly at altitudes where the air was practically non-existent? As they began the autopsy, the first shock came when they touched the skin of the aircraft. The Soviet engineers were accustomed to building tanks of the sky. The MiG-19 aircraft and the MiG-21 aircraft were rugged, heavy machines built to endure punishment, operate from rough dirt strips, and survive bad maintenance. They were built with heavy-gauge aluminum and steel. The U-2 aircraft was different. It was terrifyingly fragile. The engineers discovered that the skin of the fuselage was made of aluminum, so thin that a careless mechanic could punch a hole through it with a screwdriver. It wasn't built like a fighter jet. It was built like a competition glider. The rivets were flush-headed and shaved down to microscopic tolerances to reduce drag. The weight saving was obsessive. Every ounce had been shaved off. There was no ejection seat too heavy. There was no armor plating too heavy. But the real revelation came when they examined the wings. In a standard Soviet aircraft, the fuel is contained in rubberized bladders inside the wing structure. This adds weight and bulk. When the engineers cut into the U-2 wing remnants, they found nothing. No bladders. No tanks. The wing was the tank. The Americans had sealed the joints of the wing structure itself and filled the hollow cavity directly with fuel. It was a wet wing design. This was a concept known to aviation theory, but the manufacturing precision required to make a wing that flexes in turbulence but remains liquid tight was beyond the standard industrial capabilities of the Soviet Union in 1960. If a Soviet factory tried to mass-produce this, half the planes would leak on the runway. The Americans had done it. Then came the smell. As the chemists analyzed the residue found in the fuel lines, they were baffled. It didn't smell like kerosene. It didn't smell like standard aviation spirit. It had a distinct chemical odor, almost like lighter fluid. This led to the discovery of LF-1 Ampere. The Soviet engineers knew the physics problem. At 70,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure is so low that standard jet fuel will boil at ambient temperatures. If you put regular kerosene in a plane at that height, it would vaporize in the tanks, starving the engine and likely causing an explosion. To solve this, the Americans hadn't just built a new plane, they had convinced Shell Oil to invent a new state of matter. They created a fuel with extremely low volatility and high thermal stability. But it had a catch. It was incredibly viscous. It was thick. The Soviet engineers realized the U-2 had to have a complex system to preheat the fuel just to get it to flow into the engine. The logistics required to deploy this fuel to a remote base in Pakistan were mind-boggling. It meant the entire support infrastructure of the U-2 was a custom-built ecosystem. But the piece of technology that caused the most alarm was not the plane itself. It was the payload. The recovery team had managed to salvage the B model camera built by Hikon. Even in its damaged state, the optics were a marvel. The lens was a 36-inch focal-length monster designed by Dr. James Baker at Harvard. It weighed over 400 pounds. When the Soviet optical experts looked at the glass, they realized they were staring at a generation gap. The grinding of the lens was perfect, but the film was the true secret weapon. Standard acetate film, used by spies since the Second World War, would snap like a dry twig in the freezing stratosphere. It would shrink and warp, distorting the images. The film found inside the U-2 was different. It was thin, incredibly strong, and dimensionally stable. It was a polyester base, a material that Eastman Kodak had perfected specifically for this mission. The resolution was the final nail in the coffin of Soviet secrecy. When the KGB developed the surviving reels, they weren't looking at blurry shapes. They were looking at a high-definition audit of the Soviet Union. They could see the tail numbers on bombers parked at Engels Air Base. They could distinguish between a MiG-15 aircraft and a MiG-17 aircraft. They could see the tire tracks in the snow at the Titratgan missile test site. The KGB realized with horror that the Americans knew everything. The missile gap, the political fear that the Soviets had thousands of ICBMs was a myth, and the Americans knew it was a myth because they had counted the missiles one by one. The U-2 hadn't just been a nuisance, it had been the primary source of truth for the White House. The Soviet bluff had been called years ago. The shock of these discoveries led to a decision that defines the baffled nature of the Soviet response. Premier Khrushchev didn't just want to study the U-2, he wanted to own it. He issued a directive: copy it, clone it, improve it. This task fell to the Beriev Design Bureau. They were given the wreckage and ordered to produce a Soviet U-2. The project was codenamed the S-13. It should have been easy. They had the blueprint right in front of them. They had the physical pieces. All they had to do was measure and manufacture. But this is where the mystery of the U-2 reached its climax. The Soviet attempt to clone the plane turned into a disaster that exposed the deep, systemic rot in the Soviet industrial base. When Beriev engineers tried to replicate the thin aluminum skin panels, the Soviet metal mills couldn't produce sheets that thin with consistent quality. The metal would crack or have microscopic variations in thickness. To be safe, they had to use slightly thicker sheets. When they tried to copy the engine, they found their metallurgy wasn't advanced enough to make turbine blades that could withstand the heat tolerances of the Pratt & Whitney J57 while remaining that light. They had to make the blades heavier. When they tried to copy the landing gear, the bizarre pogo stick wheels that fell off after takeoff, they found the steel alloys were proprietary and difficult to replicate. Every time they tried to copy a part, the Soviet version ended up being 5% heavier or 10% heavier. It was the death by 1,000 cuts. By the time the design was finished, the S-13 looked exactly like a U-2 aircraft on the outside, but it was fat. It was overweight. The engineers did the math and realized the investigation into the U-2 wreckage revealed a hard truth to the Kremlin. The United States wasn't just winning the Cold War with money, they were winning it with a level of precision engineering that the command economy of the USSR simply could not replicate. You could steal the plans, you could steal the wreckage, but you couldn't steal the thousands of specialized factories and quality control processes that made the machine possible. However, the story doesn't end with the metal. It ends with the man. Francis Gary Powers was put on trial in the Hall of Columns in Moscow. It was a show trial, broadcast to the world. Powers was sentenced to 10 years, 3 in prison, 7 in hard labor. He was the most famous prisoner in the world. But the game had changed. The shoot-down of the U-2 had proven that the sky was no longer a sanctuary. The missile that hit Powers had shattered the idea of overflight forever. On February 10, 1962, on the foggy Glienicke Bridge connecting West Berlin with East Germany, a swap was arranged. In a scene that would become the archetype of spy fiction, Francis Gary Powers walked from the east toward the west. At the same time, Rudolf Abel, a Soviet master spy captured by the FBI, walked from the west to the east. They crossed in silence. Powers returned home to a cold reception. Many in the CIA and the Air Force whispered that he should have used the poison needle. He was investigated, interrogated, and treated with suspicion. It took decades for him to be fully recognized as a hero who had kept his mouth shut about the most sensitive details of the program while enduring KGB interrogation. But while the U-2 incident was an embarrassment for the US in 1960, it was the catalyst for something much darker and much faster. The CIA realized that if a missile could reach 70,000 feet, then altitude was no longer a defense. Speed was the only defense left. Even as the Russians were picking through the aluminum bones of the U-2 inches that hangar, a team of engineers at the Skunk Works in California, led by the legendary Kelly Johnson, was already welding titanium. They were building the response to the May Day shootdown. They were building a plane that didn't just fly high, it flew at Mach 3. It flew so fast that if a missile was launched at it, the standard operating procedure was to simply speed up and outrun the explosion. The U-2 was a glider that got caught. Its successor would be a blackbird that never was. The mystery of the impossible flight at 70,000 feet was solved by a missile. But the shootdown didn't stop the American surveillance program. It just forced it to evolve into something even the Soviets couldn't comprehend until it was too late. The era of the slow spy was over. The era of the blackbird and the era of the spy satellite had just begun. The KGB was baffled by the U-2. But what came next didn't baffle them. It terrified them.